The reactions to former President Trump's 2024 campaign kickoff are pouring in, and not all Republicans sound like they're on board. I want to bring in Molly Ball to talk about this. She's the national political correspondent for Time magazine. Molly, I'm really glad you're here. I feel like even before he made the announcement, it seemed like the tide was turning. That sanctimonious nickname, like from there, it seemed like people were feeling more open
because
to
he
be
criticized,
critical.
he went after someone who's winning.
Yes.
They need winners.
Yes, and right before the election, right? So, yeah, not a good look. So, Molly, in your piece this week about Trump's announcement, you talked about how, quote, Trump-tolerant Republicans are reacting to this. What are you hearing from them? And I get that because I've read comments from people saying, I voted for him twice, but this is too much.
That's right. You know, I think obviously a lot of the criticism of Trump is coming from sort of the usual suspects, the so-called never Trumpers, people like Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, who have never been big fans of Trump and perhaps will even run against him in the coming presidential race. But that tide that I think you're completely correct in sensing a tide turning. And I think you're also correct that it did start to happen even before the election, but it really intensified after the midterm elections in which Republicans fell so far short of their hopes, and in which, you know, Trump's candidates, Trump's role in this election seem to have played such a big role in Republican losses. And that's why you're hearing, you know, from the sort of consultant class to elected officials like, you know, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Winsome Sears, for example, to sort of conservative media influencers and people with important roles in that world, all sort of starting to sound more negative on Trump than they have before, starting to say it's time to consign him to the past, time for him to step aside, time for Republicans to make a new future in which they hope, as Vlad said, they hope they can win again.
Yeah, because Molly and Anne-Marie, one of the things that I think people are starting to suggest, and Molly, you can tell me if this is accurate, which is, look, I can get the policies that the president was keen to implement without the baggage. So in other words, if it's a Ron DeSantis or a Glenn Youngkin or a Mike Pompeo, they are very much in the spirit of the way Republicans and conservatives think about how this country should implement its policies, and we can do that without all the noise. Is that what you're hearing?
That's right. And it really is sort of the other side of the coin of what a lot of Republicans, traditional Republicans, establishment Republicans who went along with Trump for so long would always say that, you know, even if they had to hold their nose about some of the sort of character concerns or some of the behavior that they might not have liked, they felt that Trump was the only way that they could win and therefore implement those policies. And now sort of the shoe's on the other foot. Now you have them saying, well, you know, we want to win and Trump can't do that, but we can get these same policies, as you're saying, from someone else in the party. And so that is the argument that a lot of Republicans are now making. That being said, you know, Trump has announced his candidacy for 2024. Nobody else has done that yet. And so he now is the only one in the pool. He's the one that any Republican who wants to make this race is going to have to take on. And he's still a very formidable force in the party, particularly, you know, with his support among the Republican base. So as much as we may be seeing, you know, a falling off of his support within the party, it's certainly too soon to say that the ship has sailed.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there. You know, there is a lot of talk about sort of the lackluster way in which that hour-and-a-half long speech was received, but he does have a lot of support. He does have a lot of sway still within the Republican Party. Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan spoke with former Vice President Mike Pence one-on-one, and she asked him if there's a danger in Donald Trump becoming president again. This is his response.
Well, I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. And for 4.5 years, President Trump was not only my president, but he was my friend. But obviously, it didn't end well. And while the president and I parted amicably, I believe as we look to the future that we'll have better choices. And I'm very confident Republican primary voters will choose wisely in the days ahead about who should be our standard bearer.
So I guess this is the former vice president's way of sort of not holding back. It's a little reserved. I wouldn't call it outright criticism, but it is actually really surprising coming from him. Do you suppose that you know, what you just said about the former president's sway over the Republican Party is a little bit of what we're seeing here, that there's a desire to move forward, but he still has a certain amount of power.
That's right. You know, and obviously former Vice President Pence is one of those who potentially could be competitors to Trump in 2024. We'll have to see what decision the former vice president makes. But you see him tiptoeing away from the man who, let's not forget, tried to kill him on January 6th, or, you know, obviously played a role in that mob ransacking the Capitol and seeking to string up Mike Pence. And this is the most criticism that he can muster against the former president. That tells you, on the one hand, just how much sway Trump does have in the Republican Party, how sort of afraid of him, I think, other Republicans are when it comes to being really forthrightly critical, because to appeal to Republican voters, I think they realize that they can't go too strongly against Trump and what he represents, because there is still such a deep loyalty to him. So the million-dollar question still is, what is the Republican base thinking? We're not going to know that until the primary really gets underway in the coming months, until there are more competitors to Trump. And that's going to be the question, is how have Republican-based voters processed the midterm elections? What do they think the potential is for Trump going forward? Do they still want, because he is still a very unique figure in what he offers to the Republican Party, are they going to settle for something that's sort of Trump light, or do they still want the real thing?
And will Trump voters, some segment of them, still be engaged if he's not the nominee? That's
a big question, right? If President Trump is not the nominee, do those diehard supporters, Molly, stay home and don't even go to the polls? And if that happens, well, I'll tell you what's going to happen is the polling is going to be all skewed again. That's the only thing we know for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that and that is something that I think we're looking at with the midterms as well, right? Is with Trump on the ballot, Republicans lost again. Now with Trump on the ballot, they also lost in 2020. And so a lot of Republicans taking a hard look at the party's prospects going forward. And this is, you know, the prediction that a lot of, I think, Democrats and nonpartisan analysts have made since the beginning of Trump getting into politics, is that he has trapped the Republican Party in this sort of double bind where they can't win with him because he turns off too many independent voters. They can't win without him because they need his base to come out, and he's the only one that can drive those voters to the polls. And so if that's the case, Republicans have a real predicament. And I think we're going to see, even though they've just won the House of Representatives and are going to have more governing power going forward, let's not forget that. But I think we're going to see a lot of soul searching from the Republican Party in the months to come as they try to figure out a way forward, and whether Trump is the best vehicle for them to do that.
All right. Molly Ball, great to have you, Molly. It's been a minute. Thanks for coming by.
Great to see you. Thanks, Vlad.